Department of Health and Human Services and the aspirin industry in the past few months to alert the public to the possible dangers associated with the use of aspirin during certain childhood diseases. This hearing deals with a very serious disease, a deadly illness that strikes down hundreds of perfectly healthy children each year. This tragedy is made all the worse by the fact that this disease might be preventable. The public needs to know whether every possible precaution is being taken to spare families the agony of needlessly losing a child. Reye syndrome mainly strikes children up to 19 years of age. It is often fatal and may produce brain damage when the victim lives. It typically follows chickenpox or influenza, both of which increase during the winter months. Just when children seem to be recovering from those illnesses, they may suddenly get desperately ill and lapse into a coma with Reye syndrome. For several years, a growing body of scientific evidence has suggested that the use of aspirin is associated with Reye syndrome. Nearly 3 years ago, the evidence was the Technical Committee of the American Academy of Pediatrics to conclude, quote, there is a high probability that the administration of aspirin contributes to the causation of Reye syndrome. That committee recommended that the department would pursue a voluntary approach. She asked the aspirin industry to put warning labels on aspirin products. She raised high hopes that industry compliance would be rapid and effective. When the Secretary announced the voluntary program, we expressed our concern that unnecessary delays or non-compliance could be fatal to many children and young adults. On January 11th, we requested that the Secretary report back to the subcommittee by today on specific aspects of the voluntary program. From the information that has been made available to the subcommittee thus far, it appears that this voluntary effort is failing on 4 counts. 1, the labels that have been negotiated are inadequate and vague. They do not mention Reye syndrome and only suggest that parents consult a physician before using aspirin for children with chickenpox or flu. Secondly, little consideration was given to assuring that the label was displayed in a prominent format, clearly visible to consumers. Thirdly, with the possible exception of one manufacturer, these labels will not appear on aspirin bottles until after the current flu season. And lastly, not all of the industry is even represented in the negotiations on voluntary labeling. The scientific evidence of the link between aspirin and Reye syndrome is strong and consistent, but we are all aware that all studies have their limitations. The recently released pilot study is just that, a pilot study for a larger study that should proceed. The scientific evidence, however, is not at issue here. The Secretary of Health and Human Services has determined that the scientific evidence calls for protection action now. She has announced that preventive action should not be delayed until the larger study is completed. More and more studies may lead to better decisions, but some scientific questions may never be resolved to everyone's satisfaction. We know there are still some people who are willing to dispute the link between cigarettes and lung cancer. When a threat to the public's health might exist, public officials must decide when to act. The Secretary has made that decision. What is of concern to this subcommittee is whether the department and the aspirin industry have done enough to protect the public from this fearsome disease. If the problem is Reye syndrome, why not say so on the label? If the problem is aspirin, why not require the warning on all aspirin products? If the problem is influenza, why ignore the current flu season? The Emergency Reye Syndrome Prevention Act would take steps that might well have been ordered by the Department of Health and Human Services in January or perhaps even years ago. A clear warning would be required on all aspirin products, along with an eye-catching logo that will attract people to actually read the label. All advertisements would have to contain the same warning. Fortunately, this terrible syndrome is rare, but that is no consolation to parents who didn't know that giving aspirin to their young child could be deadly, nor is it any consolation to families with a teenager who died or suffered brain damage because there was no obvious warning on the aspirin bottle. The National Reye Syndrome Foundation tells us that 6 children died of Reye syndrome in the first 2 months of this year. Even one unnecessary death is too many. Children cannot protect themselves. Parents cannot protect their children from dangers they know nothing about. If the Department of Health and Human Services can identify risks, but then is unwilling or unable to take strong enough measures, the Congress must act. We look forward to discussing these questions with our witnesses today. Before I call on a very distinguished first witness, member of the U.S. Senate, I want to recognize Congressman Wyden for any opening comments he wishes to make.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to commend you for your outstanding work in this area, and particularly to protect the young people of this country. It seems to me what we face here is a very clear case of foot dragging on the part of the Public Health Service and the Food and Drug Administration. It seems to me that they have essentially written off the current flu season, the flu season that's just ending. And the reason these hearings are so important is that we need now to make sure that steps are taken so we don't miss the boat on yet another flu season. There's no question about the scientific evidence in this area. The evidence is crystal clear that there is a link between Reye syndrome and aspirin, and that the public needs to be protected. And it seems to me what we have to do at these hearings is identify the bottlenecks within the department, within the Public Health Service and the Food and Drug Administration that are preventing the critical warnings and the critical information that the public needs to know about the health risks in this area from actually getting out to the public. So I'm very appreciative of Chairman Waxman's leadership in this area and look forward to our important hearings. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Wyden. We're pleased to recognize a new member of our subcommittee. We're delighted that he is a member of the subcommittee and with us today. Congressman Bates, if you have an opening statement. If not, we're just pleased to have you with us.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'm just here to gain some insight into this problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And not a new member, but a very distinguished and long-term member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Scheuer. I'd like to recognize him at this time.
No statement, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scheuer. Senator Metzenbaum is the author of the Emergency Reye Syndrome Prevention Act of 1985. Senator, we're delighted you've come to our subcommittee to present testimony in support of this legislation. It is another example of your leadership in the area of consumer protection and recognition of the need for government to intervene to protect the public health. Pleased to welcome you at this time.
Chairman, I'm very delighted to appear before your committee, and I'm frank to admit to you that each morning before I drink my orange juice, I say, isn't the country fortunate that Henry Waxman is the chairman of the Subcommittee on Health and Environment. I do that each morning.
What's in that orange juice?
And your other meals as well, right?
That's right. And because it is a fact, and of course I say the first facetiously, but it is a fact, I think the country is fortunate.
It's not true?
Country is fortunate that you have stepped forward in so many health issues and been willing to provide the leadership that's needed in order to do to legislatively act when so many others would be willing to drag their feet and to think about it or appoint commissions or committees or to make further studies. Here we have a situation where we know the problem. Reye syndrome is linked with aspirin as far as children are concerned if they take it when they have chicken pox or influenza. It's indisputable. The facts are there. Now, in connection with some health matters, we don't know the answer. And if we knew the answer, it would be such a bonanza as far as the health aspects of this country are concerned. Cancer, cancer, heart ailments that occur. We don't always have the answer. Alzheimer's. What we would give to find an answer for that at the present time. But in connection with Reye syndrome, we know that the ingestion of aspirin by children when they have chickenpox or influenza does have the potential to harm the children. That's irrefutable. And we can prevent it. So why not? Now, we are not saying ban the sale of aspirin. We're saying make the parent aware of the risk. Tell the parent with a label that highlights it in color and says what the problem is. Now, the Secretary and the industry have worked out a voluntary kind of agreement. But that's not good enough. The child is ill. The child is crying. The bottle of aspirin is there. And the parent sees on the bottle, consult your physician first. The parent says, I can't reach the doctor. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. He doesn't want me to call. And besides, this afternoon, I understand every Wednesday afternoon he plays golf. And that's his privilege. But the fact is, the baby is hurting. So the parent says, well, it won't hurt that much. I'll just give him or her 2 aspirins. That's not an adequate answer. That's begging the question. Because if the doctor says what the doctor should say, the doctor's going to say, don't give the child the aspirin. So why not put it on the label? We've got to make the warning strong. We've got to make it specific. And if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Chairman, this may be the first instance in which legislators, you, I, and others who have joined with us, have ever proposed in legislation that you even have to have the color on the label, indicating so that it's not just lost in the black and white, but it has the yellow and the red to highlight it so that the parent won't miss it. We've seen that voluntary cooperation doesn't work. They tried it with infant formula, legislation that I was involved in, you supported, and it didn't work there. We've seen it with respect to food labeling, and it hasn't worked. You buy almost any product today, and you can't find out what you're getting in that product. Knowing what we know, how can we be satisfied until we're sure that we're doing everything possible to protect the children? Now, the FDA will say, as I understand it, they want to, the evidence is not complete. They want to see what the results are with respect to voluntary participation, the voluntary effort. And I would say, as the grandparent of 2 little children that I love very dearly, or as the parent of any other child, why expose that child to any risk at all if there's no need to do so? Children of America are exposed to enough risks at the present time without exposing them to something that we know is dangerous. Some risks we can't do anything about. This is something we can do something about. And I believe, Mr. Chairman, that the speed with which you have moved forward in connection with this hearing indicates that you are not going to do what so many others would like us in Congress to do, and that's to dance around the issue, to play the music, to orchestrate the issue, but not to act decisively. And I say to you that I will use every ounce of strength and pressure and persuasiveness that I have as far as moving this matter forward in the United States Senate, and I feel confident that you're going to be successful in your endeavor in the House. I congratulate you upon it and pledge you my total cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Metzenbaum. I appreciate the testimony you've given because I was astounded at this voluntary agreement that the Secretary negotiated. First of all the aspirin companies weren't even part of the negotiation, so they may not even go along with what she worked out. She decided there's a public health threat, and the public should be informed about this connection between aspirin and Reye syndrome. But then to have on the labels, and probably not even until next year, just call your doctor when you're about to use the aspirin for flu And that's what most people think aspirin's for, relief of symptoms of flu. And they don't think of, they think of children, they don't realize we're talking about up to 19 years of age. That seems to me about the most inadequate kind of warning label possible. Voluntary efforts aren't bad, but it looks like the voluntary effort here was one where they agreed to put this label on and not give her trouble in going to get something stronger because the industry seemed to know how ineffective that label would be. And then, of course, what disturbs me is this is March, the flu season, December, January, February, March, maybe into April. We have so little time to warn people for this year, and already a handful of children who otherwise should have been able to have this illness prevented have already died. Maybe this hearing will reach some families, because I don't think the warning label the Secretary negotiated will. But we've got to move legislation. Voluntary efforts are fine if they work, but voluntary efforts that don't have the chance of really reaching the public are meaningless, and therefore I think, as you do, I know, Congress must pass a law stating the logo, the warning, the kind of campaign that has a chance to inform the public about a danger of a disease that can be completely prevented if the parents would know not to use aspirin for their children for those symptoms.
Mr. Chairman, the evidence is so overwhelming in this area that it shouldn't be done. And yet I know that you will have appearing before you this morning representatives of the industry and other spokespersons who will come forward to indicate that we should not act and that we ought to let the voluntary procedures prevail. I would hope that you would ask, if not on your own behalf, on my behalf, if you had a child, or you have a child or a grandchild, would you be willing to give that child or grandchild aspirin at the time of influenza or chickenpox? And if you wouldn't be willing to do that, how can you, as an industry representative or public official, not do everything possible to see that no other child or grandchild takes aspirins into their stomachs at the time they have chickenpox or influenza? What bothers me is why the industry isn't here saying, you don't need legislation, we'll do it, you're right. Why they're using that kind of political maneuvering to do it on a voluntary basis. Are we going to affect their sales? Yea, much. So what? So what? Maybe if they had some malpractice suits or some lawsuits that frighten them, as has happened in so many other arenas, maybe that would be a deterrent. But what bothers me is that here is a known problem, not just a fictitious one, not a matter of figment of the imagination. And if it's a known problem, why the hell don't they do something about it? And why do we have to use our efforts to pass legislation to force them to do something that they should be doing on their own? Thank you, Mr.
Thank you very much. Mr. Wyden?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one very quick question, Senator, and I appreciate your excellent statement. It seems to me that what you have said is that this problem is one of political judgments. The scientific evidence is very clear. This isn't a question of not being able to go forward because of budget cuts. What's happened is the department has made a political judgment not to go forward with an aggressive program. That's why kids are being injured, and it's politics pure and simple.
I think that's correct, because I know of no reason. If there was some legitimate reason not to go forward, not to slam the door shut, then I could be simpatico. I could understand it. But in this instance, it seems to me that for some reason somebody has been able to sell a bill of goods that is the wrong bill of goods. And I think the critical question is, would you be willing to let your children or grandchildren ingest aspirin at the time of chickenpox or flu? And if not, then why will you, as a public official or an industry spokesperson, sit here and argue against this mandatory matter? Thank you, Mr.
Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Bates? Mr. Schroeder?
Well, I just want to thank the distinguished senator from Ohio for coming here. He can always be counted upon not only for wisdom and insight and high order of intellectual acumen, but sheer unadulterated guts, and that's frequently a scarce commodity in these precincts. And we appreciate your comment.
Coming from you, Mr. Schroeder, I appreciate it much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator. We'd like to now call forward four witnesses, sets of witnesses, to come and testify as a panel. First, John and Terry Freudenberger, President of National Reye Syndrome Foundation. Dr. Joel M. Taubin, Vice President, National Reye Syndrome Foundation. George and Diane Dumigan from New Haven, Connecticut. Jimmy and Gail Happel from Florence, South Carolina. You'd all come forward and please take seats up here.
Freudenberger. Yes.
What's your last name?
Well, we want to welcome you to this hearing today, and we appreciate your being with us. I want to hear from each of you very briefly on the problem, and I think it would be appropriate to start with Dr. Taubin.
Okay. Thank you, Congressman Waxman. We're all here for really one purpose, because we care, and we all, one way, have been touched by a loss or an ailment affecting our children or child with it. And there's no question that we've been searching since and trying to understand why our child died. Gregory was age 11, 1978, had chicken pox. Didn't think much about it. Developed the symptoms of chicken pox. The rash started to improve. He had the muscle aches, the headache, the rash. Our physician said, gee, watch him, give him some fluids. He had some headaches, low-grade fever, and as you say, we reached for the aspirin bottle. We gave him aspirin at that time. Within 24 to 48 hours, he developed all the classic symptoms, which I didn't recognize at that time, of Reye syndrome. The illness lasted for 2 weeks in an intensive care unit. It was so intensive that my wife Sonia and I stayed there for 2 weeks. I remember back in medical school going to a grand rounds, a medical lecture on Reye syndrome, being told at that time by the Department of Pediatrics that it's such a rare disease I'll probably never see it. Well, I didn't see it until it happened to my son, and I'm certainly well aware of it now with it. Since then, as a very active member of the Reye Foundation, trying to get the awareness through with the diseases, the symptoms, and always searching to say, gee, what happened? What do we give Gregory? Was there something in our house, our environment? Is something that's in my body with my other daughter at that time developed the same thing? Never knowing until over the past several years that it's the association, and now the real association with a drug that's so common, which is a good drug we use in other forms of medicine, but it's so common that everyone takes it for headaches, for playing sports, for nervous tension. Before a meeting like this, you may take 2 aspirin, sort of without thinking, and certainly no one really calls their physician and say, gee, do I need a prescription? You don't need one. Everyone has on a shelf, everyone has in their drawer in the office, and take aspirin. So we keep searching, keep looking, and now we found something that we can say, gee, we gave it to our son. Can we stop another parent from losing a child? Is there anything that can prevent or inhibit this dreaded disease? And it's an intensive disease. The child is well, absolutely well, playing sports, doing well in school, and develops a routine flu or a virus or chicken pox. You worry a little bit about it, but then it goes on to this devastating disease, which within 24 hours to 40 hours they're in coma, and it's devastating to lose a child. There's nothing worse ever than having a healthy child die of some disease, and even worse if you know it may be preventable. The question and the reason we're here is to help support this legislation and to make awareness for not the physicians. They should know about it now. It's in the journals now. It's given throughout the conferences. The residents at our hospitals now are aware of it. Emergency room doctors are aware of it. Even the parents are becoming aware of it now. They're saying to us, gee, I want to give them something else, but I know I heard and I know something about aspirin. What about the parents that don't know about it? Or the parents on a weekend or an evening when the child has, and it may be a 19-year-old, or maybe in college, and they may not have a parent around. You may have had the symptoms and develop some aspirin right off the shelf. No prescription needed with that. How can we stop it? We've got to look for something with this. And I think the question that was raised here today, and I asked the members of other foundations, or the Aspirin Foundation, or the Aspirin companies, would they give their child or grandparents aspirin, or the grandchild or child of any kind aspirin? And I can't imagine one of them saying, I have no problems, I give them aspirin. I just can't imagine somebody coming before this committee or coming to me personally face-to-face and saying, I have no problem with that, the statistics aren't really in, and I have no fear about giving them aspirin. And if they can do that, then they can stand at this table. But I appreciate the efforts, and I strongly urge the members of the committee and everyone here to think twice and say, we've got to make some effort and stop it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Talbot, did you want to add anything? Or your husband?
No, thank you.
Mr. Friedenberg?
Mr. Chairman and committee members, I want to preface my statement by saying thank you. From the bottom of my heart, I appreciate the time you're spending to help solve the problems associated with Reye syndrome. I'm here today as a parent of a child who was killed by Reye syndrome. I'm also here as the founder and president of the National Reye Syndrome Foundation. But most of all, I'm here to represent the children of this country. The cause of my concerns may be that little bottle of children's aspirin that was always in our medicine cabinet at home. That little bottle of aspirin may be the reason that our daughter Tiffany died in 1973. I have been fighting Reye syndrome for the past 10 years by building the National Reye Syndrome Foundation. Briefly, the foundation is made up of 130 chapters located in 40 states. We raise and provide monies for two purposes. One, to save lives through increased awareness. And number two, to eliminate Reye syndrome as a medical problem through research. The foundation started as an all-volunteer organization of parents and has grown to the extent that we now need a paid staff to maintain the day-to-day operations. The fight against Reye syndrome has been plagued by mistakes and misinformation. In the very beginning, someone gave Reye syndrome the label rare. Now everyone, including members of the media, call Reye syndrome rare. Even the Surgeon General, in his public service announcement, is calling Reye syndrome rare. We are not dealing with a rare disease. We are dealing with a disease that struck 175 children in 1 year in Ohio alone. We are not recommending that people be warned of a disease that strikes rarely, but rather that they be warned of a disease that strikes all too frequently and often fatally. In 1974, the National Institute of Health also made a mistake that delayed recognition of Reye syndrome as a medical problem. It refused to allocate research monies to Reye syndrome because they didn't think that Reye syndrome was a significant medical problem. NIH no longer holds that view, but Reye syndrome research was delayed for many years because of it. The study that implicated Reye syndrome was a mistake in planning. The only reason the study was conducted was because the Center for Disease Control's fiscal year was ending and the CDC hadn't spent all of its allocated money. A quick phone call was made, an agreement reached, and within a month, a Reye syndrome study was undertaken. The next mistake was made by the Food and Drug Administration. When the Food and Drug Administration yielded to the aspirin manufacturer's pressure and reversed its decision to label aspirin-containing medicines. The aspirin manufacturers disputed the validity of the original study and aggressively opposed labeling, to the extent that they even filed a lawsuit against the FDA. In addition, they formed an organization that they called the Committee on the Care of Children to give themselves an anonymous and more credible platform to oppose aspirin's implications in Reye syndrome. This proposed legislation is trying to avoid yet another fatal mistake. The conclusion that this committee must finally reach seems simple. First, all of the principles including the aspirin manufacturers, are in agreement that all aspirin medicines should be labeled. All that needs to be decided is whether you want a clear, strong statement or whether you want to trust the judgment and the motives of the aspirin companies. If a mistake is to be made this time, I urge that that mistake be made on the side of caution and on the side of children. I urge that you recommend and support the proposed labeling legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Freudenberg, for being with us. Mr. and Mrs. Happel?
First of all, we lost our child on February 6th of this year.
Would you pull the microphone a little bit closer? There. Good, thanks.
So this may be real difficult for me because I'm still not real strong. We've not been able to move back into our home. We are working. But I feel that it's something I can do for her. She was an only child. I have a lot of time on my hands now. They don't let you put but so many flowers at the mausoleum, so you can't do much there. But our town is small, and I will spend this time making sure that the children in our town do not take aspirin for anything, because our child had not been that sick. She only had a little cough. We gave her Congressional, which contains aspirin, this equivalent to a baby aspirin in each tablet. We had been doing that all week. On Thursday, she went to school all day. She threw up at school, but she cleaned it up herself and didn't even tell anyone about it. When she got home, she told us. She continued to throw up. On Friday, we called her pediatrician. He prescribed a suppository because we could not keep anything in her. There was so much flu that he did not want us to bring her to the office, and I was also sick with the flu. My doctor didn't want me to come out to the office either. He phoned in my prescription. On Saturday morning, she was still throwing up. She watched TV, she ate some crackers and drank ginger ale. By the time we got to the doctor at 10:30, she was already delirious. So it happens very fast. They sent us directly to the Medical University in Charleston. We were there by 1:30. They immediately started treatment after doing 2 of the blood tests to make sure that that's what she had. And when I say started treatment, they don't wait and see. By the time we saw her again, they had already put a probe in her brain so that they could monitor the pressure to enable them to keep her fluids in the right proportion so that her blood pressure would stay stable as the pressure went up. On Sunday, the pressure went so high that her brain was damaged irreparably then. In fact, the doctor has told us then, from Sunday on, she was probably brain dead. Because of this, and they hyperventilate them trying to keep their blood pressure up. Her lungs then got a hole in it, and the air was getting into her body cavity. So then her heart did not work properly. So then a tube had to be inserted to get rid of the air. Her kidneys failed. They had to put her on dialysis. And her kidneys did start to act again, but not like it should have. On Tuesday night, because we did not leave the hospital except for brief times to change. And the nights were the times that we stayed in the room as long as we could with her, because they didn't limit your time at night. In the daytime, they didn't limit your time only if they were doing something to her or to another child. You could not be in there. But on Tuesday night, the monitor quit working. It just would not work at all. We prayed that it didn't mean what it did. On Wednesday morning, the doctors came to us, and they had done another CAT scan, and they told us that she was brain dead and that they felt they should unhook the respirator, which she had been on from the very beginning. And so we agreed to let them do that because we had seen her suffer so much. And within just a matter of minutes, all of her body functions ceased. But it's something that happens so fast, and parents don't know enough to even recognize the symptoms until it is too late. And it's not rare because she went to a very small school, and they lost a child in that school last year. They have 2 teachers who have lost children to Reye syndrome as far back as 10 years ago. And she had aspirin. So I feel that if I had another child, I would never buy aspirin or an aspirin-related product again, because what she had happened so fast.
Well, thank you very much for sharing that story. How old was she?
She would have been 7 on Monday.
Thank you very much. I'd like to hear from Mr. and Mrs. Dunnigan. I wonder if Mr. Happel, you could pass the microphone over there. Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Dunnigan, right.
Yeah.
Good morning. Thanks very much, too. Name's George Dunnigan. This is Diane. We had a daughter, Jill, that gets sick with Reye and still is. On January 3rd, the same symptoms that you had, just like lightning, it happened. She had the flu. She's getting over from the flu. She wants to go out and she wants to play. And she can't go out and she can't play. We take her into our local doctor. He rushes her immediately to St. Raphael's Hospital in New Haven. Within about 10 minutes, she's there. She's diagnosed within about an hour and a half. She's rushed over to Yale New Haven Hospital, which is the treatment center locally. She's been in Yale New Haven. Well, let me give you a little bit of background, too. We go in there and we're the same anxiety, the same tension, the same everything that you're feeling and anyone else is feeling when they see their children hurting. We're told 3 to 4 days something's going to happen. Or possibly 6 to 12 days. At the outside chance, 16 to 22 days. 16 to 22 days, right? The first time, 3 to 4 days, we're up all night and all day. Diane's either up at nights, or I'm up at nights, or she's up in the day, or I'm up in the day. 3 to 4 days pass, we watch the monitors, we see the brain pressure go up to whatever, 40s, 30s, 50s, whatever it is. We see all the other regulators, we're watching it. 3 to 4 days pass, and that's passed. We're saying to ourselves, well, isn't it supposed to get better? Isn't it supposed to get better? 6 to 12 days passed, same thing. 6 to 12 days, watching the monitor go up and down, blood pressure go up and down, everything else. After the 12th day passed, we're saying, well, it's going to be 16 to 22 days. Hey, that's it. 16 to 22 days pass. What happens still? She's still in the monitor. We're still watching the brain pressure. We're still watching the blood pressure and everything else. After 30 days, the doctors are saying, we don't really know what to tell you because no one's been this way before. After 35 days, the same thing. After 40 days, the same thing. After 42 days, 43 days, what happens is she starts to come out of it. And she starts to come off the medication and off everything else. What's happening with her right now is she's in Newington Children's Hospital in Connecticut. She's been taken from Yale New Haven, and I can gladly report as a parent that at least she's living. She's in Yale Newington Children's Hospital, and she's talking, she's walking, and some of the other functions that we do and take for granted. Let me just tell you one other thing, too, before I finish. More than likely, in looking around at the ages of people in this room, you're probably all 25 to 45, 50 years old. More than likely, you've been brought up with the TV ads. Take 2 aspirin, fruit juice, get sleep, and what's going to happen to you is you're going to get better. Well, do you know something? In many cases, that may be true, but it's not true in all cases. It's not true in all cases. And And it strikes me that if there is a relationship between the taking, the ingestion, the taking of aspirin, and the getting of this dreaded viral disease, Reye, if there is some connection, that you should know about it. You should know about it so that your children don't get the same thing. Something else. One night, about the 20th night, 25th night into the whole ordeal, Diane was talking with one of the doctors there and saying, what about this? What could we have done differently? Obviously feeling, as every parent probably would in here, what did we do wrong? What could we have done differently to change this? One of the doctors turned around to her and said, you know, it's very similar to aspirin poisoning. Very, very similar. We've heard statements from Congressman Waxman this morning limiting the age to 19. You don't have to be a teenager or an infant to get it. You can be older and still get it. Do you know something? You can be you and still get it. Right here, right now, you can be you and get it by taking it. Does it happen in all cases? No. Can it happen? Yes. Should you be aware of it? Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, Mr. and Mrs. Dunnigan and Mr. and Mrs. Happel, your children have been affected this year, this flu season. Of course, you didn't know taking aspirin was anything dangerous. Same was true of Freudenberg and Taubens, although you experienced the same thing some time ago. You just didn't know. Now, let me ask you, maybe I'll address this to Dr. Taubin. You're not only a parent, but a physician. I don't know if you're a pediatrician or not, are you?
No.
What would you recommend to other worried parents when they hear about something called Reye syndrome that they never heard about before, and they want to protect their children from Reye syndrome? What should they do?
I think, you have to believe in what you hear on through your pediatricians, through TV now, and through PTA groups. Several years ago, we tried, and I became the National Vice President of Rye's Foundation, and John and I have worked throughout the country and for awareness and research projects, and trying to let family members, not only the pediatricians or family doctors, aware of this disease. It was very difficult 4 or 5 years ago to have PTA groups hear us. It was very difficult to have pediatricians hear us because they say, geez, so aware, I've never seen a case. And 4 or 5 years ago, there were 2 sentences in a pediatric book, say you'll never see it again.
And now that they know about it, people have heard about it, what should parents be aware of? What do you tell parents?
What we tell parents now is if in a symptom complex, if they have a flu or viral syndrome, we know what those are, the muscle aches, the headaches, little nausea, or chicken pox, don't take aspirin or aspirin products. There's many over-the-counter aspirin products. If the child gets very ill, call your pediatrician. If he says to you, and we tell us on the phone, they call us, they say, gee, for the fever, high fever, take aspirin. Say, is this Reye syndrome? Is there a question? Many parents are aware of it now. We don't have to treat every symptom. You don't treat every fever or muscle ache or headache or sore throat with a drug. Most of them get better. The country is so involved in taking medication. This is one change to say you push away and you say, gee, don't take it. It will hurt you rather than help the situation. If there's any question in your mind, you call your pediatrician. If he doesn't know, and there's a possibility he may not know the symptoms, then go to your nearest emergency room and hopefully they'll know the symptoms. And if you're not sure at all, don't take it.
Mr. Dunnigan, when did your child take the aspirin? What date approximately? Was it this January, February?
First few days of January.
First couple of days of January. Around the time the Secretary was saying that she acknowledged the fact there was a problem and we had to do something about it and started to talk to the aspirin manufacturers about some voluntary action on their part to warn people. If you picked up an aspirin bottle and it said on that label, if you're looking at flu symptoms, consult your physician, would that have meant anything to you as parents then? I mean, now you know, but then that you shouldn't give your child that aspirin?
I don't know whether I'd think about it that much. If it just said, contact your physician, she was sick in the middle of the night. I mean, those things happen. You just give it to them in the middle of the night.
Middle of the night. Mr. Dunn?
I respond on that, too. Different people respond differently to information. If you say to some people, look, hey, you don't take aspirin, period, under these conditions, getting over flu or getting over chickenpox, that works. That works. With other people, it may not necessarily be the case. You may have to say to them, hey, don't take aspirin when getting over from these conditions, and here's the reason why. We know now in the country the authority that doctors had 50 years ago when they said, hey, don't do this, is not always taken by people the same way. So you may have to give reasons for not doing it now. There is no question about it that if you put a label on the aspirin, that would work for a lot of people. No question about it. And pediatricians should still know that, hey, the reason you don't take it is this, these things can happen for it, and that's why not to do it. When our child went in January 3rd to Yale New Haven eventually, you don't read the newspapers, you don't watch TV or anything else. By the 8th, 9th, 10th of January, a lot of people were calling up and saying, how's Jill? Saying, well, we don't know how Jill is. She's much the same. Did you give her aspirin? Did you give her aspirin? That was the question that was echoed over the phone time and time and time again. And the answer was, yes, we gave her aspirin. Yes. Is it so different from what you would do? Is it so different from what you would do? Probably not. Probably not. The awareness that was made through the TV, the newspapers, certainly helped a lot of people, no question about it. And I think would have helped us too.
Mr. Freudenberg, you're the chairman of the Parents Organization, and we have later in the hearing today testimony we're going to receive from the group called the Aspirin Foundation, and they're going to tell us that the Rye's parents groups oppose a mandatory aspirin label. Do you agree with that statement? Is that your position?
No, that's not my position at all. There are 3 parent groups combating Reye syndrome right now that I'm aware of. The National Reye Syndrome Foundation in Bryan, Ohio, the Reye Syndrome Association of Michigan, with whom just last week we agreed to merge with. And those are the 2 largest groups. There is another group based in Denver that is a very weak group and a small group and has always yielded to the Aspirin Foundation's opinions. It was last year when the Aspirin, or 2 years ago when the Aspirin Foundation's opinion that there shouldn't be any labeling, the Denver group thought that there shouldn't be any labeling. Now
so there's evidently a parents group that seems to...
They're weak and they need the money of the Aspirin Foundation, I believe.
Well, I wasn't aware there was another parents group, but you're saying there are 3 parents groups.
There are 3.
2 of the groups do support a warning label, and the third one, for whatever reasons, takes a different position.
Yes.
Some industry spokesmen have criticized this legislation as unnecessary and needlessly frightening to consumers. Do you agree?
No, not at all. We've been faced with that kind of idea for a long time. From the very beginning, we've been out, when we were driving home from the hospital after Tiffany had just died, I said to Terry, we've got to send out letters to doctors and tell them what Reye syndrome is. So that's what I've been doing for over 10 years now, is telling people what Reye syndrome is. And you go into a community and you get resistance. You go to the school nurse and you say, hey, we ought to hand this out. And she goes to the county health department and talks to the doctor there. And too frequently we hear, we don't want to panic the community. They'll take this information. You know what their definition of panic the community is? That doctor's going to get some phone calls. Their kid's going to be sick, and they're going to get a phone call on whether to use aspirin or not. And I say that when you're a doctor, you're committed to that. You're committed to treat people. And ignorance is no way to solve a problem.
Let me say to all of you, the time I've been chairman of the this health subcommittee, over and over again, I've been impressed by the fact that the people who know the most are the people who have had to live with the consequences of an illness or disease, more than the doctors and more than the drug manufacturers and more certainly than the government officials in charge of protecting the public health, because they've taken the time through the painful experience they've had to try to understand why things aren't being done that should be done. I can't imagine anything more frightening than having a child with Reye syndrome. And I'd rather have a warning on an aspirin bottle to warn a parent about this danger, even though it may scare some people. That's exactly what should happen. People should be alerted that a terrible thing might happen. The fact you've been willing to come here today and share your own personal experiences with us has been very helpful to us. I know that you committed yourself to working to inform other parents and the medical community and the Secretary of Health and Human Services and everyone else that this could have been avoided in your circumstances, and you want to see it avoided with other families so they don't have to go through what you've gone through. Mr. Wade?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I just want to commend all of you for your great courage and your tenacity. It seems to me it shows a special strength to be out continually working for changes, and I only have one question. You all have been directly affected by this, and you've dealt with government, basically government at every level with respect to trying to get solutions to this situation. Do you think that by and large government has been responsive? Has government by and large been listening to you and listening to these concerns of parents? You started to make a comment, Mrs. Dumagoon.
No, I don't think government's been responsive enough. I, too, am in the medical profession. I'm a nurse, and I didn't know that much about Reye syndrome other than the name, and I don't think anybody who hasn't experienced it or seen it in an intensive care unit can imagine it. I mean, you just can't imagine what your child's going through. They have a tube into their brain. Our daughter had 4 ventriculostomies into her brain at different times. They have at least 3 or 4 IVs going into their veins or arteries. They can be on dialysis. They lose weight. My daughter developed bed sores for the times that she couldn't be moved because of the terrible pressure in her brain. I mean, I've seen ICU patients, and it's devastating when you see children like this. It's the most intensive therapy I've ever seen. And I don't think government's been responsive. I mean, I think we need a label warning that says Reye syndrome, and people really need to know what Reye syndrome is. Not just a name, but they need to know the devastation that this wreaks on a family and the child.
And any of you others?
If I might comment, I've been working with government for 10 years, and like some of your comments today, I don't know why we couldn't have had labeling already at the start of this flu season. And in those 10 years, what I've had to learn is to be patient. It just takes a long time, and I don't think it needs to take a long time. And I think I'm seeing more and more response from government, and I think there is still more needed.
We've been gearing a lot of the comments this morning to parents, but in the last few years we've seen a large increase in the number of Reye syndrome cases that have occurred in late adolescence. And this warning is very important for the children in this country who are self-medicating. And we need that warning on there, because when they're sick, they're away, they're going to go and put their hands on a bottle of aspirin as fast as they can. They're not going to ask their parents if they can take something. They're going to go ahead and do it. That warning label has to be on there for them as well. Last year in Ohio, we lost 2 adults, one 19-year-old and one 27-year-old man. It's happening in the adult population. We're not recognizing it in children as well as we should be, and we're certainly not detecting it in the adults. But it's there, and one day we'll know a lot more about Reye syndrome than we know right now.
I really appreciate that comment, because it seems to me that probably this evening, millions of Americans of all ages are going to head home and reach for an aspirin bottle. And it seems to me that what you have said is that we need a little bit better information before we make that decision. And I described on my opening statement that I felt the federal government just dragged its feet. I'm not sure whether it's bureaucratic bumbling or just plain indifference, but clearly it's got to change. And just the fact that all of you were here to deliver this information because you've been directly affected is going to speed that process up, make it more likely that we get at this in an expeditious way. And I thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bates, questions or comments?
The only question I had is the circumstances that have occurred and what you've, members of the panel, have had to live through is hard to even imagine, and certainly everyone would have to try and empathize and sympathize with the situation. I was curious with the Reye syndrome organization that you founded and that some research is being done. Is there, how much do we know in terms of the conditions or the kind of individual that would be susceptible to the aspirin? It seems that in terms of the use of aspirin, a tremendous use of aspirin, and even if it's not a rare disease, it seems to strike only at random or certainly not everyone who takes aspirin gets Reye syndrome. I'm just curious as to what research and what more should be done in that area to try and determine more about it. Anyone who has any knowledge on that.
Yeah, I think one of the problems we have is not totally reportable disease. I mean, when you get statistics out from the Community Disease Center and they say there's a certain number of cases, they're not being reported. The disease, if it's classic, you may not miss it. A pediatrician, an emergency room doctor. Many children are taken to an emergency room because of vomiting. And during the flu season, you talk to an emergency room doctor, they'll tell you, gee, here's another case of the flu and another case. Overwhelmed with it. The problem we have is that it masquerades as other diseases. And a teenager who goes into the emergency room screaming and cursing and yelling and unkempt behavior, the first thing to think of is not Reye syndrome. They're going to think of a drug overdose. As they told our pediatricians told us, you must have overdosed your child with some other medication, and then you think about Reye syndrome. A child with a virus or a flu who develops vomiting and headaches and irrational behavior with screaming or lethargy, or an infant who has a seizure, you think of a meningitis or an inflammation of the brain or encephalitis, not Reye syndrome for that. So how many cases in this country are sitting in where the university hospitals or small hospitals and called something else and never called Reye syndrome, and at that time, because of high fevers, giving aspirin in the hospital? We all know that John and I have been through cases of children being tied down or in psychiatric hospitals, and there's one in Maryland a couple of years ago, and was told your psychiatric case, drug overdose, and a child eventually died, and autopsy showed Reye syndrome. How many physicians have seen this and are unable to report it? And we have a pediatrician here in the area who tried to report to the CDC approximately a number of approximately 13 or 14 cases about 3 years ago, and was sent back from the CDC form saying, gee, document better, more forms, fill out. He got so disgusted, didn't send it in. So you have a listing in our journals from the CDC of Reye syndrome, but there may be many, many more unreported cases or cases masquerading as another disease. And that's even more important for legislation, because a child may not have all the classic symptoms. So they may say, gee, I'm not going to bother my physician at 2 o'clock in the morning or Saturday or Sunday, or he's so busy and it's not a prescription drug. I just go to the shelf and get some aspirin or bufferin or something with aspirin in it and give it to the child and develop the symptoms. So, yeah, one of the biggest things we have to do is get a better reportable disease, a better way of reporting the number of cases, a better way for a physician to send to the CDC or the local state health department a means of identifying known cases of Reye syndrome. There's 5 stages of Reye syndrome. There's now considered a stage 0, in which there's minimal symptoms, little headache after flu or virus, they get little vomiting, and they get better with this without even seeing their doctor. And how many of us have children? How many of us had children who have had a cold or little flu symptoms? You wouldn't think of calling your pediatrician doctor. Gee, stay home from school today. Let me call your Your teacher will be home for a day or two, take a little fluids, a little weak soda, and maybe some aspirin, you'll get better tomorrow. And maybe they do get better. But how many of those cases took the aspirin and wanted to develop Reye syndrome in such a mild stage of Reye syndrome that could have totally be, stopped? And there isn't a member of this board here or other members of the families have had a disease who will live with them the rest of their life knowing that we gave something that killed our son, Gregory, and the child here. How can you forgive ourselves with it? We gave him such a simple, over-the-counter, inexpensive medication that's on every counter and every shelf in every office in this country that could have, prevented this disease and had him here with us today. I don't want to be here. None of us want to be here. We have a reason to be here, and hopefully there'll be no more parents sitting before you next year or 2 years from now. And the flu season's not over. You have another month. And you got to start now. You have to give every chance a child or parent to survive and live. Because as I said here today, it's the most devastating illness you're going to see. It's an infant or a young adult or a teenager who's absolutely healthy, doing absolutely well, and develops an illness that's common, the flu or chicken pox that everybody knows about. It's not so bad. And within 24 hours in coma, intensive care is the most intensive day you're going to see. Night and minute of decisions to make, catheters, surgery done, ventilators, medication, monitors. It's mind-boggling. And even for myself as a physician internist, to be up in 2 weeks in that intensive care and watch our son and look at those monitors and knew what they meant was devastating. And I'll never forget it, and for our family too, with it. And the only hope we have and support we have from we as family members and our other children say, gee, you've got to do something now. You can't worry about how much money they're going to lose for the aspirin people, and you wait for more studies and more articles come out, and more letters to the editor of certain journals like I see in our fields of medicine. You can't do that. If there's a problem, you stop the problem now and be aware of it. And God, if there's a reason not to give it, why take a chance and wait for 15 journals to come out 10 years from now? It's in the textbooks. Textbooks 2 years behind. Do it now so it doesn't get into the textbooks. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bates. Mr. Scheuer?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I want to express my appreciation to these witnesses who've come and tell them how deeply touched I have been to hear their testimony. It's almost a heart-wrenching, it is a heart-wrenching experience, especially for anyone who's a parent. I raised 4 kids, and I realized how lucky I was.